Let's practice writing about bias. In all of these situations, what potential sources of bias do you see with these survey methods? Name the type of bias, explain why, and also say how the bias will reflect the response variable. So of course it's important to know what the response variable is to start with. So here's the first situation. People are randomly stopped on the street and asked, do you support harsh immigration policies that would send American-born children of illegal immigrants away from the only home they have ever known? So the question, the wording of the question is obviously going to cause response bias. It's obviously going to influence the responses. So how would we describe the response variable here? Do you support this immigration policy? So basically the percent who support the deportation of American-born children of illegal immigrants. So how is the bias going to reflect the response variable? The wording of the question encourages people to not support the deportation of American-born children of illegal immigrants. So this method will underestimate the response variable. People are more likely to say, no, they don't support the deportation than the general population would be if the question was worded in a more neutral manner. Secondly, the Metropolitan Police Department is concerned about its image. They develop a survey which is administered in person by uniformed police officers to a randomly chosen sample of households. Okay, the police department is concerned about its image, so the survey probably has something to do with some sort of approval rating of the police department. So that would be the response variable. Response bias is caused by using a police officer to administer the survey. That will cause the approval rating to be overestimated because people will be afraid to give a negative opinion to a policeman. Now some people said, well, what about non-response bias? Maybe people chose not to answer. Well, if you relate that to the fact that we have a uniformed police officer, that could also be a possible answer, that people would choose not to respond because they were afraid. However, in this case, I would say the better answer would be a response bias, because this person, this interviewer, is clearly influencing people's responses, whether or not they meant to. In this third example, the school board wants to survey the senior class about their high school experience. The week before graduation, each member of the senior class is emailed a link to an online survey with the request to complete the survey before graduation day. The main problem here is voluntary response bias. Not all of the seniors will respond. So basically they're self-selecting themselves into the sample. We will most likely get an overrepresentation of the people with strong opinions, either positive or negative, about their high school experience. It would have been better maybe to have taken a random sample of the senior class and just asked them personally about their experience. A city planning committee wants to estimate the mean number of cars per household in Indianapolis. There's the response variable. That's what we're trying to estimate. To evaluate the need for more parking areas. Okay, so maybe downtown parking garages, how many do we need with this many cars in the Indianapolis area, something like that. They obtain detailed aerial photos of the city and randomly select 250 locations on the map using a coordinate system. A single-family home nearest each selected location is identified, and an employee is sent to that house to ask how many cars are owned by members of that household. The committee returns to each selected home until they get a response. Now some people said, oh, that's going to annoy people. Well, maybe it will, but the whole point of that last sentence is that we're trying to avoid a non-response bias. In other words, we're going to follow up on the people who weren't home or the people who didn't respond the first time and try to get all of the people in our sample to respond. So that is not the bias. That is to help prevent bias, actually. The bias here is that we have some undercoverage. Single-family homes nearest each selected location are identified, but no apartments are included in the sample. So single-family homes generally contain more people than apartments do. Not always, but many single individuals live in an apartment by themselves, whereas single-family homes are likely to have a couple of adults, maybe a teenager, maybe small children, but maybe have more room to park cars with a garage or a driveway instead of in an apartment where you might only have one parking space or so for your cars. So only using single-family homes may overestimate the mean number of cars per household because apartment dwellers probably have fewer cars on average. Now, I did have one student say, well, what about people that live in apartments? They tend to have roommates, and every person and they're usually adults, and every person has a car, but maybe in a single-family home you might have adults and children, and not every person has a car. Well, maybe you could make a case for that. And if that was your argument, you might say that it might be an underestimate, but you have to relate the fact that we only have single-family homes included, this undercoverage, to the effect on the response variable. The next one, a statistics student decides to estimate the average number of AP classes taken per student during their 4 years at Covenant by selecting one government class at random and asking each student to write down the total number of AP classes they've taken. Well, if all the government classes were similar in makeup to seniors as a whole, this would be a very good way to take a cluster sample. We would randomly select one cluster of seniors and interview everybody in that cluster, and that would be like a miniature representation of the entire class. However, at Covenant, government classes are different. Some are We the People. There's even an AP government class now. There are regular government classes. So if we only picked one government class, we'd probably have undercoverage. Depending on which class is chosen, the average number of AP classes could be either overestimated or underestimated. If you pick a We the People class, that tends to be students who are a little bit more high achieving, motivated to take harder classes, so maybe they're going to have a higher average of AP classes than a regular government class would. So if that was a regular cluster where all the classes were the same, then that might work as a good method. A local political candidate randomly selects 100 residential addresses from her district and sends a member of her staff to each selected address to ask a voter in that household their opinion on some key issues. We don't really know a lot about this sampling method, so probably the biggest issue here would be the non-response bias. People might not be home, or they might refuse to participate in the survey, so we wouldn't get everybody in the sample included. So the question is, how might the respondents differ from the non-respondents in some important way that would affect the response variable? So let's say the issue was, are you in favor of raising taxes to support the local public schools? So we need to think about who might be home and who might not be home. So let's say a lot of retired people are home and the people who are not retired are at work and they are not available. Would the retired people be more or less likely to support taxes for schools? Maybe they would be less likely because they don't have children in school, so that issue is not important to them. Maybe the people who are at home are more likely to be unemployed or underemployed than the people who are away from home who might be at work. So maybe the people who are at home say, sure, raise my taxes, because I don't have a job anyway and it won't matter to me. Whereas the people who weren't at home might have said, no, don't raise taxes because I have to pay a lot of taxes and I don't want to pay more. So you need to think about how that the people who are not responding and the people who are responding are different in a way that will affect the response variable. That is important. So this is a way these are the important things you need to consider when writing about response bias or bias questions.